today's episode, we're discussing a very interesting encounter as documented by Rupert Matthews in his book Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. I will also be reading a resource later on in the video, which is another telling of the event, and it's just basically a retelling of it, a little bit of a different way of telling the story. There's some extra details in there. And then after that, we'll talk about why I feel this is important. So without any further ado, let's get right into the story. At 3 a.m. one autumn morning in 1928, a fur trapper from the Nootka tribe called Muchalat Harry came paddling back to his home on Vancouver Island in his canoe. Dressed only in his underwear and suffering from exposure, he was clearly terrified. Because he was babbling, the family sent for the local missionary, Father Anthony. It was Father Anthony who recorded the story and so preserved it for later generations. Muchalat left his home and headed for the Canooma River, at the head of Tulipana Inlet, where he intended to spend several weeks trapping fur. He paddled some way upriver, then cached his canoe and walked 12 miles, or 19 kilometers, inland to what he thought was a promising fur area. After pitching camp, he sent his trap line and settled down to business. All seemed set for a routine trip. One night, he was jerked awake by being roughly picked up. Wrapped in his blankets, but otherwise clad only in underwear, he was thrown over the shoulder of a big, hairy, man-like creature. Muchalat had heard stories about the Sasquatch since his childhood, so unlike Albert Ostman, he immediately guessed what was happening. He struggled, but the creature held him firmly. Muchalat estimated that he had been carried for about 3 miles before being dumped on the ground beside a steep hill with a rock overhang. Collecting himself, he looked about and was alarmed to see himself surrounded by about 20 Sasquatch. The bigger males were pushing the females and the young back from him, as if to keep them safe. The alarm turned to terror when he saw a pile of bones lying on the ground because they showed obvious signs of having been gnawed. Muchalat was convinced that he had been brought in as prey and would soon be killed and eaten. He backed nervously against the rock while first one, then another male Sasquatch came up to him. The Sasquatch seemed fascinated by his underwear, which they plucked at repeatedly. Muchalat guessed that they thought it was some kind of loose second skin. After a while, the males lost interest and allowed the females and the young to get closer to the terrified Muchalat. When it was fully light, the majority of the adults left, presumably to search for food, and Muchalat was left with the young and a couple of adult females. An hour or so after noon, the 2 females laid down the rest. So he fled. He ran downhill, hoping to find a river, which he did. After running downstream for about 15 miles, as fast as his legs could carry him, he found his canoe and then leapt in and started paddling. There was no sign of pursuit, but Muchalat did not care. He just wanted to get home. Muchalat Harry was confined to bed by Father Anthony, and it was about 3 weeks before the missionary would let him leave his home. It was during this time that Muchalat Harry told Father Anthony about his experiences. It was decided that Muchalat should keep quiet about the bizarre events, although he discussed it with his friends and Father Anthony wrote it all down. Muchalat Harry never went back to the Canooma River to collect his rifle, equipment, and furs. Nor did he ever go alone into the forests again. Now, a few things about this encounter are really quite interesting to me. The first is that although Albert Ostman's encounter is reported to have happened in 1924, 4 years earlier than Muchalat Harry's encounter, it's said that he did not make the reports of his encounter public until 1958, that being Albert Ostman. So there's really no reason to believe that Muchalat Harry had heard of his story, as far as I can tell, to then go and try and make up a story of his own. I also find it very interesting that these encounters both happened in British Columbia. Now, technically Vancouver Island is separate, right? It is an island. Looking at Google Maps, the approximate location, it is a little difficult to measure because Google Maps is, well, a pain to try and find some things at, especially when they're way out in the bush. But if my measurements are correct, then the distance between where Albert Ostman's encounter and Muchalat Harry's encounter happened is approximately 96 miles or 154 kilometers apart as the crow flies, which I find very interesting. British Columbia, that entire area, including Vancouver Island, have had some very interesting encounters. So Muchalat Harry is certainly one of the most interesting that you could ever really look into, because if his story is correct, we did a video just a little bit ago about some things that could have influenced the sighting. Now, it does seem like Father Anthony didn't suspect anything on Muchalat Harry's part, so that does add a degree of credibility there. But for all you know, he inhaled some sort of mold that influenced the sighting. However, it's hard to really know because, as far as I can tell, there's really no documentation as to what he ate, what kind of food he brought with. Did he bring any rye? Did he ingest any mushrooms, thinking that they were a good-to-eat variety, and in fact picked a psychedelic mushroom on accident? You know, there's really no documentation that I can find on that. If you know, please let me know. I'm very interested about that. But this kind of encounter, assuming that it is true and that he saw what he thinks he saw, affirms that Bigfoot does in fact eat meat, affirms that they can have larger groups of individuals, and does confirm that they kidnap people. And this is one of 3 encounters that I've talked about on the channel that have basically been confirmed. Obviously, there were no cameras there to physically confirm everything down to the last detail, but according to the person that was there and was kidnapped, this is the 3rd time that someone has been reported to have been kidnapped by a Bigfoot or Bigfoot-like creature. Now, I want to read one other resource for you all. This was only one of 2 I could find, of course the book being one of them. But trying to find other resources was quite difficult. There really are not a lot. There really isn't a lot out here that I could find. So the one I did find here had some interesting word choices. Called the creatures Big Feet instead of Bigfoot. I find Bigfoot is like moose or sheep. One word covers both plural and singular. So anyway, I'm going to read this story as faithfully as I can, but I will not say big feet. It just doesn't quite sound right to me. So anyway, this was written by Peter Byrne. This was transcripted. This is on the Bigfoot Classics page, and I will have a link to it in the description box below. This was in the Search for Bigfoot 1975, and then it also says the story of Muchalat Harry is an outtake from Mr. Byrne's book with his permission, 1999. So that's interesting. But anyway, I'm going to start reading it here. According to the Indians, there was once a large number of Bigfoot living on Vancouver Island, a large island, 12,408 square miles in area off the west coast of British Columbia. The Indians knew about them, feared them, and respected them, but granted that they were harmless. One of the Indians of the Nootka tribe who lived at Nootka in 1928 claims to have been carried off by them and held captive for some time. The story, told to me by Father Anthony Terhar of Mount Angel Abbey in Oregon, is a curious one. Father Anthony, a much-loved missionary priest who traveled the west coast of Vancouver Island for many years, was living at Nootka at the time of the story, and he knew Muchalat Harry very well. Muchalat Harry was a trapper and something of a rarity among his fellow tribesmen. He was, according to Father Anthony, a tough, fearless man of excellent physique. In the course of his trapping, he would spend long weeks in the forest alone, something that the average Indian did not do in those days. The Indians of the coast were apparently a rather timid people, and they seemed to regard the deep forest as the home and territory of the Bigfoot. When they went into the deep inland forest for any reason, they never went alone. Muchalat Harry was different from other Indians. He went to the forest alone and feared nothing. Late one autumn, Muchalat Harry set off for the woods with his traps and camping gear. His plan was to set out a trap line and stay in the woods for several months. He headed for his favorite hunting area, the Canooma River, at the head of Tulipana Inlet. From Nootka, he paddled his own canoe to the mouth of the Canooma. There he cached the canoe and headed upstream on foot. Approximately 12 miles upstream, he made his base camp and, after building himself a lean-to, started to put out his trapline. One night, while wrapped in his blankets and clad only in his underwear, he was suddenly picked up by a huge male Bigfoot and carried off into the hills. He was not carried very far, probably a distance of about 2 or 3 miles at the most. When daylight came, he was able to see that he was in a sort of camp, under a high rock shelf and surrounded by some 20 Bigfoot. They were of all sizes and sexes. For some time, they stood around him and stared at him. The males to the front of the curious group, females behind them, and young ones to the rear. Muchalat Harry was frightened at first, and his fear grew to terror when he noticed, he said, the large number of bones lying around the campsite. When he saw these, he was convinced that the Bigfoot were going to eat him. The Bigfoot did not harm him in any way. Occasionally, one came forward and touched him, as if feeling him, and when they discovered that his skin was loose, it was in fact his woolen underwear, several came forward and pulled at it gently. While they looked at him and examined him, Muchalat Harry sat with his back to the rock wall and did not move. He was cold and hungry, but his thoughts were only on escape. Sometime in the late afternoon, curiosity on the part of the Bigfoot seemed to slacken, and with most of the Bigfoot out of camp, probably food gathering, he thought, there came the opportunity that he needed. He leapt to his feet and ran for his life, never looking back. He ran downhill, toward where he guessed the river to be, and sure enough, he soon came to his campsite. In what must have been blind panic, he bypassed this camp and ran for 12 miles to where his canoe was cached at the mouth of the Kenuma. Father Anthony describes the story of Muchalat Harry's arrival at Nootka as follows. It was probably 3 in the morning. He and his brother were asleep and the village was quiet. Suddenly there was a series of wild cries from the waters of the inlet. Lights were lit and he and others hurried down to the water's edge. There, near frozen and exhausted in his canoe, lay Muchalat Harry. He was barefoot and clad only in his wet and torn underwear, and he had paddled his canoe through the winter night 45 miles from the mouth of the Kenuma River. Father Anthony and his companions carried the almost lifeless form up from the water's edge. It took 3 weeks to nurse Muchalat Harry back to sanity and good health. Father Anthony, who took him into his own care, did the nursing, and he told me, Peter Byrne, that during the course of these 3 weeks Muchalat Harry's hair turned to pure white. The story of the kidnapping came out slowly. At first, Muchalat Harry would talk to no one. Then he told Father Anthony what had happened, and later others. When he was fully recovered to health, he was asked when he planned to go back to collect his belongings, the camp equipment, his pots and pans, his trapline, and above all, his rifle, at the lean-to on the Kenuma. In 1928, a trapline and all of its pieces must have been worth a great deal to an island Indian. A rifle alone would be regarded as a highly prized possession. But Muchalat Harry never went back to the Kenuma. Not only did he never return there, according to Father Anthony, he never left the settlement at Nootka, never went into the woods again for the rest of his life. He preferred to lose all of his valuables and probably hard-won possessions rather than risk another encounter with the Bigfoot. Late in 1972, I had the occasion to visit Vancouver Island. I was on a routine investigating trip when I found myself at Nanaimo, not too far by road from the west coast and the scene of Muchalat Harry's adventure. I stopped in Gold River and obtained from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police some maps and instructions on how to get to the Kenuma River area. Nowadays, there is a logging road that runs all the way down to the mouth of the river, and one Sunday morning, with the logging trucks out of the way, I drove there and made camp on the Kenuma. I spent several days there, walking the riverbed and exploring. I tried to make a rough determination of where Muchalat Harry might have had his lean-to, and I found a place that offered a good campsite, 12 miles from the mouth of the river on the edge of a series of high bluffs. The salmon were running in the Kenuma while I was there, and all night long I could hear them splashing up the shallow waters of the river. In the morning, Black Bear worked the river, getting the salmon that had come ashore in the night or had become tangled in the limbs of fallen trees that lay in the river. I counted 6 bears in several days. The country was generally wild and deserted, and the actual mouth of the Kenuma, where it flowed into the salt waters of the inlet, was one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. Some of the forest close to the river had been logged off, but the logging work had moved on west, and while I was there, it was quiet. The days began with morning mists on the river and then warmed to the clear crispness of perfect autumn weather. Evenings were cool and damp, and nights bright with starlight that provided almost enough light to read. I found no sign of Bigfoot on the Kenuma, nor any sign of Muchalat Harry's trapline or lean-to. I hardly expected to find anything of the latter after 40-odd years, but even though Muchalat Harry was long gone, the river and the forest remained unchanged. The splashing salmon, the cold, clear water of the Kenuma, the moss-covered banks, the shallow pools in the forest that the Kenuma drained, that were the breeding places of the salmon, the riverbeds, the plodding bears, the deep, silent waters of the inlet, all were as they must have been 40 years before when Muchalat Harry cached his canoe and made his camp there. So that's a very interesting article there, and outtake from his book, apparently. I really appreciate some of the extra details that he included there that Rupert Matthews just did not have enough space to include in his book. But I greatly appreciate Rupert Matthews for including that story in his book, because I would not have known about it otherwise. And I'm sure some people probably have heard it before, but it is very, very interesting. And it does reaffirm the idea that Bigfoot could very well be behind some of the missing 411 case files that I have investigated and that many people are quite interested in. Because missing 411, a lot of these people, if they are found again, are found 3 or 4 miles away from where they were supposed to have been missing, if not farther. There was no real reason for them to be able to make it that far. They're often naked or almost completely naked, and some of that is attributed to hypothermia, where people will start ripping off their clothes because they feel like they are incredibly hot, like a very bad hot flash where they have to rip off their clothes, or at least they feel like they have to, but in fact it's actually a sign that you are freezing to death. It's really quite a sad thing. But in this case, he was not really wearing much when he was going to sleep, and they were quite interested in what he was wearing. So I do find the clothing to be interesting, as one person brought out in a forum discussion. His lack of wearing shoes is quite interesting, because a lot of missing 411 case files have that detail of the individual shoes were never found, or they were not wearing their shoes at the time of their disappearance. And yet they were found a very considerable ways from where they went missing, and their feet were not cut up, which implies that they were carried or moved. One very interesting detail is that his hair turned white. And this is something that Marie Antoinette and Thomas More, before their executions, supposedly had happened. And it's believed that very high amounts of stress can bring that on. And it seems in his case he underwent enough stress that his hair suddenly turned white, which is a very odd thing, and that is not something that should happen. It's typically a very slow transition to white hair for most people, from what I could find. Now, what he went through, I cannot say. Of course, there is always the possibility that it was induced, or that he was mistaken and it was fear-induced, but I don't get that feeling from this account. I'm very curious to know if you have any extra details about what he may have eaten on that occasion. I would absolutely love to know, because if it was a mushroom or something, you know, that is very pertinent. Doesn't mean that what he said happened didn't happen necessarily. It just means that what happened was not what he interpreted as being. For example, he could have been surrounded by bears or something. I don't know. But again, I don't really see that being very likely. There wasn't a lot of people out there, so it's unlikely that he was surrounded by a lot of people, which would have been the most likely mistaken thing that he could have gone through. And certainly he went through something. It's not like he just showed up in the bar one day and started telling people a story. You know, the guy ran for miles and miles and paddled his way from there all the way to Nootka, which, you know, I'm really amazed by that. And clearly he was absolutely exhausted. It sounds like he used every last bit of strength he had to get there. And I feel really bad for the poor guy, because you know what he went through was really difficult. And so, yeah, I do not see any reason why he would have lied there, given that Father Anthony said he knew him quite well, and there's no mention of him thinking that the fellow was in any way lying or misleading. It's a pretty strong case, I'd say, for what he said he went through being true. And unfortunately, you do have to question a lot of sightings and figure out if the person is playing one over on you and trying to make a fool out of you. But I do not think that's what happened here. And I really think that this is a great example of what a lot of people are talking about when they say that Bigfoot could very well be to blame for a lot of missing 411 disappearances. You can certainly see it. And if you look at some of the videos I've made on the topic, I think you'll kind of see what I mean there. So anyway, guys, not a lot more to say here, so I'm just going to close the video out by saying thank you guys so much for watching. Please feel free to hit that like button, that subscribe button. Making an effort to get to 1,000 subscribers so I can start making money off of this. And I'm not trying to do this just to make money, obviously, but that is a big help. I put a lot of effort into these videos. This is one of the more laid-back videos I've done. There's a very important video I'm trying to put together about the biological impact that Bigfoot, and more importantly, multiple Bigfoot, could make on the environment they live, and the kind of resources that they would need to survive in an area, the amount of food that they eat in a day, in a year, looking at herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and trying to figure out approximately how much these creatures would need to eat given their weight and size. I think it's a very important piece of information. The problem is actually finding out how much these animals eat. You know, the bears are pretty easy to figure out, but a lot of these other animals, there just isn't a lot of research on them in the wild for me to really find. Mountain goats, for example, no one knows. Snow leopards, no one knows. Bighorn sheep, there's a little bit, but still not that much at all. And so it's taking a lot longer than I was hoping to research that video. So I put a lot of effort into these guys. I look forward to making that one. We'll see how it goes. But if you want to see more of this kind of content, please feel free to hit that little bell icon after you click the subscribe button. That way you can be notified every time I come out with a new video. And again, yeah, please feel free to subscribe. It would really help me out. And sharing this video, clicking that share button and copying the link and sharing this to anyone or anywhere you think would enjoy this video would be very appreciated. And I will have links once again to the book and to the article there. All the credit goes to the authors of these books. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.